The sound of the gavel echoed through the Manhattan Civil Courthouse like a warning that there was no turning back. It wasn't just noise. It was a line being crossed. Grace Bennett sat alone at the defense table, her back straight only through sheer force of will. The wooden bench felt too hard, too cold, as if it had been designed to remind her that this was not a place of comfort. It was a place of judgment, not just legal judgment, human judgment. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, fighting a tremor she could no longer fully control. The wedding ring was gone, removed months earlier, but the pale mark on her finger remained, a silent scar. Her eyes drifted across the courtroom, not searching for help, but trying to stay grounded, trying not to drown under the weight of the moment. She was alone, literally, no attorney beside her, no friends in the gallery, no visible family. The chair next to her was empty, and that emptiness screamed. Across the room, Keith Simmons looked like he was in an entirely different world. While Grace felt every second stretch painfully long, Keith appeared relaxed, almost bored. He leaned back in his leather chair as if watching a predictable performance, one he had already seen and already knew the ending to. His custom-made Italian suit fit like armor, dark fabric, sharp lines, a light-colored tie chosen carefully to project authority and control. On his wrist, an expensive watch caught the sterile courtroom lights. A subtle detail, but impossible to miss if you knew what you were looking at. Keith wasn't looking at Grace. He didn't need to. He knew exactly where she was. Beside him, his attorney flipped through a thick stack of documents with slow, confident movements. He was well known in these circles, not for kindness, not for empathy, but for ruthless victories. A lawyer nicknamed the Shark, because once he bit, he never let go. Keith leaned in and whispered something into his ear. The attorney smiled. Not a wide smile, a precise one. The smile of someone who already believed the game was over. Grace felt her stomach tighten as she heard their quiet laughter. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was intimate, confident, cruel. She tried to breathe. In, out. But every breath felt like something was tightening inside her chest. 3 days earlier, her life had been frozen. Not metaphorically, literally. She remembered the exact moment she realized something was wrong. She was at the grocery store, carefully choosing the cheapest items, counting every dollar. When she swiped her card, the machine flashed red. Transaction declined. She tried another card. Declined. She opened her banking app. Account frozen. All of them. Checking, savings, investments, even the account holding money her mother had given her years before the marriage, untouched until now, was inaccessible. She called Keith. No answer. Texted him. Nothing. Then came the email. Cold. Technical. For preventive measures, all assets have been temporarily frozen pending divorce proceedings. Preventive measures. That was the phrase he used. That was the moment Grace understood this wasn't just a divorce. It was a siege. Back in the courtroom, the judge adjusted his glasses and flipped through the file with the neutral expression of someone who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. To him, this looked like another routine case. A well-represented man. A woman without counsel. A prenuptial agreement that appeared airtight. Nothing unusual. "We are here to finalize the divorce proceedings between the parties," the judge said, without fully looking up. "Mr. Simmons, your legal representation is noted. Mrs. Simmons," he paused. "Do you confirm that you are appearing without an attorney?" Grace felt every eye turn toward her. She swallowed hard. Before she could answer, Keith spoke. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, with rehearsed concern. "Unfortunately, my ex-wife failed to take the necessary steps to secure representation. We attempted to resolve this amicably, but she chose to complicate matters." His attorney nodded slightly, reinforcing the narrative. Grace felt her face burn. "That's not true," she said, her voice low but steady. "I didn't have access to my money. I couldn't hire anyone." Keith let out a short laugh. "She's trying to delay," he said. "That's always been her way." The attorney leaned forward. "A common tactic, Your Honor." The judge sighed. "Mrs. Simmons, without legal counsel, my duty is limited to verifying the validity of the prenuptial agreement. Was the document signed voluntarily?" Grace's heart raced. She remembered that day vividly. Keith had placed the contract on the kitchen table between 2 cups of coffee. He told her it was just a formality, that smart people did this, that it protected both of them, that it had nothing to do with trust. She was 23, in love, and she believed him. She started, but her voice faltered. Keith leaned forward. "She signed it, Your Honor," he said firmly, freely and willingly. The attorney opened his folder. "We have proof." The judge nodded slowly. "Very well. In that case..." Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment. She felt the weight of defeat approaching. But then, the courtroom doors opened, and the sound cut through the air like thunder. The judge aligned the papers on his desk with deliberate care, as if order on the page might somehow contain the tension filling the room. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, his voice procedural and restrained. "The prenuptial agreement establishes full separation of assets. If validated, there is no provision for spousal support, no financial compensation, and no right to remain in the marital residence." The words landed slowly, deliberately. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. No support, no compensation, no home. The place where she had lived for nearly a decade, the walls she had painted, the kitchen she had cleaned, the rooms she had learned to walk quietly through, reduced to a legal technicality. She opened her mouth to speak. Keith didn't let her. "Your Honor," he said calmly, folding his hands together. "I believe it's important to note that my ex-wife was fully aware of these conditions from the beginning. I was transparent. I even allowed her to remain in the house during the proceedings." "Allowed?" Grace almost laughed. She remembered sleeping in the guest room while he locked the master bedroom, remembered cameras appearing in corners without explanation, remembered the way his phone would flip face down the moment she entered a room. "Mrs. Simmons," the judge continued, "do you confirm that you read the agreement before signing?" Grace inhaled slowly. "Yes," she said. But nothing." Keith's attorney interrupted smoothly as he stood. "The contract is explicit, Your Honor. The signature is authenticated. There is no indication of duress." Keith tilted his head slightly, satisfied. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked directly at Grace. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It was superior, as if he were watching someone finally understand their place. "You should have been more practical," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough. "Emotion never wins cases." Grace felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to stand, to scream, to tell the truth about everything he had done. But she was trapped. No money, no lawyer, no voice. The judge cleared his throat. In light of the absence of legal representation and the apparent validity of the agreement, he lifted the gavel. Keith smiled. Not broadly, precisely. The attorney beside him closed his folder with a sharp snap, the sound echoing like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Grace closed her eyes, and then Keith decided to humiliate her completely. "Your Honor," he said, rising from his seat, "I'd like the record to reflect that Mrs. Simmons attempted to delay proceedings by claiming financial hardship, circumstances that, as demonstrated, are not my responsibility." The judge nodded absent-mindedly. "So noted." Keith turned toward Grace. His gaze dropped briefly to the empty chair beside her. "You see," he said quietly, "you couldn't even afford a lawyer." The silence that followed was brutal. No one intervened. No one corrected him. Grace lowered her head. Something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Keith mistook it for surrender. He leaned back again, confident, comfortable, already planning his next steps once the gavel fell. What he didn't know was that this silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. Because outside that courtroom, someone was checking the time. Someone who never arrived late. Someone who had no intention of letting that sentence be spoken. The courtroom doors didn't slam open. They didn't creak. They opened with a quiet finality that somehow felt louder than any sound. The judge's hand froze in midair, the gavel hovering just above the desk. His eyes lifted instinctively, drawn not by noise, but by presence. The attorney beside Keith frowned, irritated by the interruption. Keith turned slowly, confidently, already annoyed that something had dared to break his moment. And then he saw her. The smile vanished, not gradually, not politely, instantly. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened. The relaxed posture collapsed into something rigid and alert. The woman walking down the center aisle of the courtroom didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She didn't glance around to measure reactions. She walked like someone who knew exactly where she was, and exactly why she had come. She wore a dark tailored suit, elegant, restrained, professional. No unnecessary jewelry, no flashy colors. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back neatly, exposing a face marked not by softness, but by experience. This was not a woman who asked for permission. This was a woman who took space. Grace looked up at the same moment. At first, her mind rejected what her eyes were seeing. Then recognition hit her like a physical force. Her breath caught. Her heart skipped. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "Mom," she whispered. The woman stopped beside the defense table, set a leather briefcase down gently, and placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You're not alone," she said quietly. "You never were." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Whispers spread. The judge straightened in his seat. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "please identify yourself for the record." The woman lifted her chin. "Catherine Bennett," she replied. "Attorney, New York State Bar, active license." She paused. "And I am the defendant's mother." The reaction was immediate. A collective intake of breath. Heads turning, pens pausing mid-note. Grace closed her eyes for a second, overwhelmed. Keith felt cold, not metaphorically, physically. He leaned toward his attorney. "This is a stunt," he muttered. "It has to be." The attorney didn't answer. He was staring at Catherine with a look that wasn't confusion. It was recognition. "Your Honor," the attorney said quickly, standing, "we were not notified of any change in legal representation." Catherine turned her head slowly toward him. Her expression was calm, controlled. "Notification was not required," she said. "Representation may be established at any point prior to final judgment." She opened the briefcase. Inside was not chaos. It was precision. Organized folders, certified documents, sealed flash drives, printed records with timestamps, account numbers and metadata. Not preparation made overnight. Preparation made long before today. "This court," Catherine continued, now addressing the judge, "was moments away from validating an agreement obtained through financial coercion, asset concealment, and deliberate manipulation of judicial process." Keith shot to his feet. "That's outrageous!" he snapped. "She signed that agreement willingly." Catherine didn't turn to him. She didn't need to. "She signed," Catherine said calmly, "after every one of her financial accounts was frozen." The judge's brow furrowed. "All of them?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor, including accounts established before the marriage." Grace's hands trembled. She had never fully understood how deep it went. "That was a temporary measure," Keith interrupted. "A financial precaution." Catherine pressed a button on her phone. The courtroom screen lit up. Messages appeared. Recovered texts, emails, time-stamped communications. "Freeze everything before the hearing. No money, no lawyer. Once it's done, we move it back." The courtroom went silent. Grace covered her mouth. She had never seen those messages. Keith shook his head violently. This is taken out of context. Of course it is, Catherine replied. Just like the offshore entities you established weeks before filing for divorce. She placed additional documents before the judge. Cayman Islands, Panama, Malta, all linked to the same IP address, all used to move funds in fragmented transfers to avoid detection. The attorney beside Keith turned pale. Your Honor, he began. I'm not finished, Catherine said quietly. She removed another envelope. Here are records of cryptocurrency purchases made with marital funds, stored in cold wallets, secured in private vaults. The judge leaned forward now, reading, rereading. Keith's breathing became shallow. What you attempted, Catherine said, was not just to bankrupt my daughter, it was to deny her access to justice. She finally turned to Keith, and you assumed she wouldn't fight back. The judge lifted his eyes. Mr. Simmons, he said slowly, do you wish to respond? Keith opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time since the proceedings began, he had lost control of the story, and everyone in the room could feel it. The courtroom remained silent, but it was no longer passive silence. It was focused. The judge slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the desk in front of him. The small gesture sent a chill through Keith's spine. He had seen that motion before, not as a defendant, but as a spectator. It was the moment a judge stopped merely listening and began evaluating intent. Ms. Bennett, the judge said, his tone controlled but firm. The court understands the seriousness of your claims. I will need everything presented clearly and sequentially. Catherine nodded. That is exactly what I intend to do, Your Honor. She stepped forward, positioning herself where both the judge and the gallery could see her clearly. She didn't rush. She allowed the weight of what had already been revealed to settle into the room. Let us begin with the prenuptial agreement, she said. Keith crossed his arms, attempting to reclaim some sense of control. That agreement was signed legally, he insisted. With witnesses. Signed, Catherine replied calmly. Yes. Legally obtained? No. She lifted a document. This is Mrs. Simmons' bank activity from the 48 hours preceding the signature. Every account was frozen. The judge leaned in. All of them? He asked again. All, Catherine confirmed, including accounts established before the marriage. That constitutes direct financial coercion. Grace felt her throat tighten. She remembered that night, sitting on the couch, staring at her phone, refreshing apps that refused to load. Remembered the panic. Remembered Keith's voice telling her it was better to resolve everything quickly. Mr. Simmons, the judge said, did you authorize the freezing of your wife's accounts? Keith hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Yes, he said, but they were interconnected accounts. They were not, Catherine countered immediately. Here is the separation documentation filed years earlier. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Simmons, answer directly. Keith swallowed. I don't recall the technical details. Interesting, Catherine said, because you seem to recall them clearly when instructing your accountants. She pressed another button. The screen displayed logs, timestamps, IP addresses, access records. These communications show remote access to Mrs. Simmons' phone, Catherine explained. The same IP address used to manage the offshore entities, the same IP used to delete messages. The attorney beside Keith shot to his feet. Your Honor, that is a serious allegation. And one supported by forensic analysis, Catherine replied, already placing another report on the judge's desk. The judge scanned the document. Mr. Simmons, he said slowly, did you have access to your wife's devices? Keith exhaled sharply. We shared passwords. Catherine tilted her head slightly. So you confirm you had control over her devices. Keith realized the mistake instantly. That's not what... It is exactly what it means, the judge said. Control is highly relevant here. The atmosphere thickened. Catherine continued. Now, regarding the concealed assets. She distributed copies of a chart, lines, arrows, figures. Funds were transferred from the joint account into newly formed corporations. Those funds were then fragmented into smaller transactions and partially converted into cryptocurrency. That's asset management, Keith snapped. Not a crime. Failure to disclose assets in legal proceedings is, Catherine replied, especially when done to mislead the court. The judge studied the chart. These wallets, he said, pointing, are they traceable? Yes, Catherine said. And here are the access records to the physical vaults where the cold wallets are stored. Keith began to sweat visibly. This is an invasion of privacy. No, Catherine corrected. This is court-authorized financial tracing following credible indicators of fraud. The attorney shifted uneasily. Your Honor, he said, given the scope of these new disclosures, it may be prudent to request a recess. Denied, the judge said immediately. Proceed. Keith attempted to sit, then stood again, unable to settle. Mr. Simmons, the judge said, you are facing significant legal exposure. This is a setup, Keith shouted. She planned all of this. Grace flinched. Catherine turned slightly. Your Honor, she said, I request that the defendant's hostile behavior and attempted intimidation be entered into the record. So noted, the judge replied. Keith realized in that moment that he was isolated. His attorney avoided his eyes. The judge's tone had shifted, and the narrative he had controlled for months was unraveling, piece by piece. The predator was beginning to understand something fundamental. He was no longer hunting. He was trapped. The judge sat silently for several seconds, scanning the documents spread across his desk. His expression had changed. This was no longer a routine proceeding. This was an assessment of credibility, intent, and consequence. Keith noticed, and panic set in. Mr. Simmons, the judge said calmly, given the seriousness of the allegations and the evidence presented, this court will allow you the opportunity to give formal testimony. You are under oath. Do you understand? Keith nodded quickly. Yes, Your Honor. His voice sounded thinner than he intended. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, old habits attempting to restore a sense of authority that was already slipping away. Do you confirm, the judge continued, that you authorized the freezing of Mrs. Simmons' financial accounts prior to the signing of the prenuptial agreement? Keith took a breath. I authorized a temporary suspension, he said. On financial advice. Catherine tilted her head slightly. Temporary, she repeated. An interesting choice of word. Can you explain why this temporary suspension occurred exactly 48 hours before the agreement was signed? Keith hesitated. It was a coincidence. The attorney beside him closed his eyes. A coincidence, Catherine said evenly. That included freezing accounts established before the marriage. Keith wiped sweat from his temple. They were linked. They were not, Catherine replied immediately, sliding another document forward. Here is the separation record filed years earlier. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Simmons, answer the question directly. Keith swallowed. I don't recall the technical specifics. Curious, Catherine said, because your memory appeared quite precise when messaging your accountants. She pressed the remote. More messages filled the screen. No money, she signs. Afterward, we move it back. A murmur spread through the gallery. Grace felt her stomach twist. She recognized his words, his tone, his certainty. Mr. Simmons, the judge asked, did you write these messages? Keith shook his head too fast. I don't recognize the context. Do you recognize the number? The judge pressed. Yes. The account? Yes. Then you wrote them. Silence. Keith closed his eyes briefly. Yes, he said. The attorney leaned in, voice tight. Keith, you're incriminating yourself. Keith turned on him. You said everything was under control. I said that based on what you told me, the attorney replied quietly. You lied. The judge made a note. Now, he said, let's address the offshore entities. They're legitimate investments, Keith said quickly. When were they created? Catherine asked. Before the marriage. She slid a document across. Registration date, 3 years after the wedding. Keith blinked. That must be an error. All of them? Catherine asked calmly. Or only the ones that expose you? The judge leaned forward. Did you disclose these assets in this proceeding, Mr. Simmons? Keith hesitated. No. Why not? They weren't relevant. Catherine stepped forward. Millions in concealed assets are not relevant in a divorce, Keith snapped. She didn't deserve it, he shouted. I built everything. She just existed beside me. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Grace felt the words hit harder than any blow. The judge slammed the gavel. Control yourself! Keith's breathing became erratic. I was protecting myself, he insisted. She would have taken everything. You tried to leave her with nothing, Catherine corrected. And it's documented. The attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, he said, voice strained. Given the direction this testimony has taken, I must request to withdraw as counsel. Keith spun toward him. What? You misrepresented material facts, the attorney said, and you are exposing yourself to criminal liability. The courtroom buzzed. Request noted, the judge said coldly. Denied at this time. Keith felt the ground give way beneath him. He was alone. Then the side door opened. A woman entered, well-dressed, tall, nervous. She avoided Grace's eyes, and avoided Keith's. But when their gazes met, fear flashed across her face. Call the next witness, the judge said. The bailiff announced, Sasha Miller. Grace's breath caught. Sasha walked to the stand with hesitant steps, sat, clasped and unclasped her hands. Ms. Miller, the judge began, did you maintain a romantic relationship with Mr. Simmons during his marriage? Sasha closed her eyes. Yes, the word echoed. For how long? Almost 3 years. Grace felt something break, and strangely, it no longer hurt the way she expected. Did Mr. Simmons discuss the divorce with you? Catherine asked. Yes. What did he say? Sasha inhaled deeply. He said he needed to financially destroy Grace so she wouldn't fight back. The courtroom froze. Keith shook his head wildly. She's lying. And he said more, Sasha continued, voice trembling. He said once everything was finalized, the money would return, that the freeze was just a strategy. The judge closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his expression was pure outrage. Keith finally understood. There was no escape. The courtroom was completely still. Not the stillness of boredom, not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of impact. Keith sat rigid in his chair, his hands clenched together, knuckles pale. The man who had entered the courtroom confident and composed now looked like a stranger inside his own body. His expensive suit no longer looked powerful. It looked heavy, like a reminder of arrogance that no longer had a place to stand. The judge inhaled slowly, deliberately. This court, he began, his voice low and controlled, has reviewed extensive evidence of financial coercion, asset concealment, false statements under oath, and deliberate manipulation of judicial process. Keith shifted in his seat. This is not a misunderstanding, the judge continued. It is a pattern. Keith opened his mouth to speak. Sit down, the judge said sharply. Keith obeyed instantly. Grace felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain others could hear it. Each word felt suspended in the air, stretching time itself. Mr. Simmons, the judge said, you weaponized financial power to isolate your spouse, deny her legal representation, and force an agreement under duress. The judge paused. You believed the absence of counsel meant the absence of resistance. Keith swallowed. You were wrong. The judge lifted the gavel. Therefore, this court orders the following. Effective immediately. The gavel struck. All assets belonging to Mr. Keith Simmons are hereby frozen in full. A restrained gasp rippled through the courtroom. Domestic and international bank accounts, corporate holdings and partnerships, trusts and shell entities, cryptocurrency wallets, real property held directly or indirectly. Keith shot to his feet. "This is insane," he shouted. "You can't—" "I can," the judge interrupted coldly, "and I am." Grace covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Catherine remained perfectly still. "Additionally," the judge continued, "the court recognizes Mrs. Grace Bennett Simmons' exclusive right to the marital residence." Grace's knees nearly buckled. "Mr. Simmons," the judge said, "you are ordered to vacate the property within 2 hours." Keith stared in disbelief. 2 hours? That's impossible." "Impossible," the judge replied evenly, "is what you attempted to make her life." The gavel struck again. "You are further ordered to pay 100% of all court costs, legal fees, and associated expenses incurred by the respondent." Keith's breathing became erratic. "And this ruling does not end here," the judge added. The courtroom held its breath. "Based on clear indicators of fraud, perjury, falsification of records, and concealment of assets, this case is hereby referred to the district attorney for immediate criminal investigation." The words landed like a final blow. Keith didn't react at first. Then his shoulders sagged. The man who had once smiled in victory now looked hollow. "You are not merely losing this case," the judge concluded. "You are facing serious criminal exposure." The gavel fell one final time. "Court is adjourned." For several seconds, no one moved. Grace felt her legs trembling, her body struggling to process the release of months, years, of fear. Keith remained seated as court officers approached him to explain next steps. He didn't look up. He didn't argue. He didn't even seem to hear them. Catherine turned slowly to Grace. "It's over," she said quietly. Grace nodded, tears falling freely now. But the story was not finished yet. Outside, chaos erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, microphones were thrust forward. Grace walked beside her mother, sunlight hitting her face, as if for the first time in years. Then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Grace!" She stopped, turned. Her father, Catherine's ex-husband. He wore a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We need to talk," he said. "About the apartment." Grace frowned. "What apartment?" "The one in your name," he replied. "The one you bought with money I loaned you. Now that things have changed, I think it's time we settle that." Grace's heart raced. Before she could answer, Catherine stepped forward. "Loaned?" she asked calmly. He nodded. "I have paperwork." Catherine opened her briefcase once more. "So do I." She pulled out documents. "That property was never a loan. It's protected under a family trust established years earlier." His face drained of colour. "And this signature," Catherine continued, holding up the page, "is forged." Silence. "I have forensic verification," she added. "Would you like to test that claim in court as well?" He took a step back, then another, and disappeared into the crowd. Grace exhaled deeply. The final shadow was gone. The car was parked, the engine was off. Outside, the city continued moving at its usual pace, unaware of what had just collapsed inside one courtroom. But inside that vehicle, there was a silence unlike any Grace had known before. It wasn't tense. It wasn't heavy. It was clean. Grace leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a long moment. Her body was finally catching up to what her mind was still struggling to process. The threat was over. "I didn't think I'd survive this," she said quietly, "not physically, but as a person." Catherine didn't answer right away. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. "That's what men like Keith do," she said at last. "They don't just try to win, They try to erase. Grace swallowed. For a long time I thought it was my fault, that I should have seen it sooner, that I should have been stronger. Catherine turned toward her. Survival isn't weakness, she said firmly, and waiting for the right moment isn't surrender. Grace nodded. She finally understood. In the days that followed, Keith Simmons's name spread, but not the way he had planned. Audits were opened. Accounts remained frozen. Companies were placed under review. Partners quietly distanced themselves. The attorney who once sat beside him stopped returning calls. Sasha left the city, and the man who believed he controlled everything now needed permission to access his own life. Grace, meanwhile, experienced something she hadn't felt in years. Normalcy. She walked through her home without fear of hidden cameras. She slept without her phone lighting up with veiled threats. She breathed without asking permission. There were no celebrations, no champagne, just peace. 1 week later, a message appeared on Grace's phone. An unknown number. "You destroyed everything." She read it once, then deleted it. No anger, no reply. For the first time, she didn't need to explain herself to anyone. The truth already had. Months passed. Grace returned to school, rebuilt her career, recovered her financial independence, and something far more valuable, her voice. She learned that abuse doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it hides behind the word control. Keith thought he had won when he froze accounts, thought he was untouchable when he humiliated her publicly, thought the courtroom would be just another stage for his performance. But he forgot one simple truth. The truth may take time, but when it arrives, it doesn't ask permission. It enters, it dismantles, it stays. Grace didn't walk out of that courtroom as a victim. She walked out as proof that silence isn't the absence of strength, it's preparation. Because some women don't enter battles to fight, they enter to end them. Have you ever seen a turnaround this powerful? Comment the moment you realized everything had shifted. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their worth. Subscribe for more stories where justice arrives, even when all hope seems lost. Because sometimes, the greatest victory isn't destroying the person who hurt you. It's surviving and moving forward.